is no experience like gazing down the nuclear gun barrel at the other side and realizing that everything you stand for and have dreamed of and have hoped for could be blown up.
The alternative to compromise was nuclear war and the devastation of the east coast of the United States and a large portion of the Soviet Union.
The Cuban Missile Crisis began on October 16th, when photos from U-2 spy planes conducting reconnaissance work in Cuba appeared on President Kennedy's desk. The Soviets were building missile sites a mere 90 miles off the US coast. President Kennedy had to decide how to respond to the situation and what to tell the American people. In a 13-day gauntlet, Kennedy and Khrushchev fought for political superiority with high-stakes maneuvers that put both of their nations in the line of nuclear fire. The reputations of both countries, and the impact that these reputations had in the global conflict between capitalism and communism, were political responsibilities less important than protecting the people. Diplomatic relations between Cuba and the United States began to turn sour in the wake of the Spanish-American War. The United States originally promised to liberate Cuba from Spanish rule and make it an independent state according to the provisions of the Teller Amendment of 1898. However, the Platt Amendment, ratified in 1903, made Cuba a protectorate of the United States. The U.S. continued to intervene in Cuban affairs and support corrupt but U.S.-friendly governments until Fidel Castro led a successful revolution in 1959. Relations between the U.S. and Cuba deteriorated rapidly thereafter. The United States engaged in covert operations against Cuba, including multiple assassination attempts against Castro, and an outright invasion in 1961 known as the Bay of Pigs, which was a complete failure. The Joint Chiefs of Staff even drafted a top-secret invasion plan, known as Operation Northwoods, which employed unethical means to start a war. In addition, the U.S. military openly performed invasion drills in the Caribbean to overthrow a fake leader known as Orstak. When U.S. embargoes strained the Cuban economy, the Cubans turned to a new trading partner and ally, the Soviet Union. Khrushchev saw Cuba not only as a potential ally, but also as a way to even the scales of power between the US and the USSR. If Cuba became a cohort of the USSR, it would not only represent a political victory, because a country subject to heavy US influence had favored the Soviet Union, but also a strategic victory in the balance of missile placements around the world. Khrushchev therefore offered to protect Cuba from a likely US invasion.
Fidel Castro himself felt that the only way they could defend Cuba, and again, this is a defensive act as I would see it, is with nuclear weapons, because that's the only thing the U.S. would respect. There was no way they could give Castro enough conventional weapon to deter a determined U.S. invasion.
Castro cooperated with Khrushchev, and missile silos were secretly installed in Cuba. Despite pressure from senior advisors not to place nuclear missiles in Cuba because of a possible hostile reaction by U.S. officials, Khrushchev stubbornly insisted that constructing missile bases in Cuba would effectively counter the placement of U.S. missiles in Turkey. One reason that Khrushchev was so daring was because he saw President Kennedy as weak and inexperienced due to the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. Khrushchev knew that he was making a dangerous gamble to improve the position of the Soviet Union, because one false step could mean nuclear war and the loss of millions of lives. While Khrushchev faced down pressure from his advisors in the Soviet Union, it was clear to Kennedy that he had to come up with an appropriate American response. President Kennedy was backed into a corner with Soviet nuclear missiles aimed at him. He could not proceed without the risk of provoking nuclear actions by the Soviet Union, but backing down would damage the US reputation, and by extension, the capitalist reputation in a world split between communism and capitalism. The symbolic nature of the struggle was evident. Castro was completely left out of negotiations. The crisis was not a war between countries, it was a war between ideologies.
The U.S. had to respond even if it was done at the cost of a possible nuclear exchange, the death of 40 million Americans and perhaps an equal number in the Soviet Union. Underscoring how seriously the Americans and the Soviets took the issue of the symbolic importance of this.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff advised Kennedy to launch an immediate invasion of Cuba, coupled with airstrikes on the Soviet emplacements. Though Kennedy made preparations for such an invasion to take place at a moment's notice, instead of invading Cuba, he decided to enact a blockade.
A strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated.
Kennedy still considered invading Cuba, but he decided to wait and see how events unfolded before he pursued this irreversible and possibly catastrophic course of action.
Kennedy showed a certain amount of political courage by not giving in to those voices and offering Khrushchev some way out.
Neither Kennedy nor Khrushchev wanted the crisis to end in nuclear warfare. The events in Cuba had attracted the attention of the entire world. The US and the USSR were not the only countries that would be affected if either leader slipped while on the precipice of nuclear war. Both Kennedy and Khrushchev realized that nuclear detonation was no longer hypothetical. Khrushchev began to back down in the face of nuclear annihilation despite his stubborn nature. By the end of the crisis, Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a pledge that the United States would never invade Cuba and would remove US missiles in Turkey and Italy. The removal of US missiles was, however, kept a secret by Kennedy's request. Kennedy was worried about the reputation of the United States if the agreement appeared to reduce the US's protection of its European allies. The Cuban Missile Crisis proved that not only was compromise the solution to nuclear confrontations, but also that winning the symbolic chess game of military power between the United States and the Soviet Union was not worth a nuclear war.
And the reason for the compromise was simply, it was the next best thing to nuclear devastation. And I think we can all breathe a sigh of relief that they decided that.
The Cuban Missile Crisis also emphasized the difference between Soviet and American ideologies. In the USSR, Khrushchev withheld knowledge of the Soviet missiles in Cuba in order to preserve the secrecy of the operation. But even as the crisis progressed, Khrushchev never formally announced the situation to the people of the USSR. Kennedy was initially quiet about the situation and left his campaigning trip on October 20th, claiming illness to avoid evoking panic. But he alerted the citizens to the fact that Soviet missiles were being readied in Cuba when he gave his quarantine address on October 22nd. When an American U-2 spy plane was shot down above Cuba and its pilot killed, it became apparent that tensions were so high, war could start at any moment without the consent of either leader. This was visible to the American public and created fear, which exacerbated the situation in the eyes of the media. The situation did not, however, occur in the USSR because of the tightly controlled media. In this respect, Kennedy had a responsibility to inform his people, due to the democratic system which he represented, and Khrushchev was able to avoid panic by keeping his citizens in the dark due to the strictly controlled centralized government.
The Soviet citizens were absolutely oblivious to the fact that there was a crisis that had moved the world within inches of nuclear war.
Khrushchev knew that by compromising he lost his gamble, and as a result he was removed from power in disgrace. Every country has a responsibility to defend its citizens, and Kennedy and Khrushchev had a responsibility to ensure national security. But through the course of the crisis, this responsibility was often contorted and used to justify a symbolic power struggle that placed the lives of citizens on both sides at risk. After the crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev remained committed to solving the question of nuclear weapons, working together to create the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963. Kennedy and Khrushchev both made concessions, because they realized that nuclear war was the price of a symbolic victory.
Both powers committed themselves to stabilizing the status quo significantly rather than pressing advantages that could trigger any kind of worldwide conflagration.
While the Cold War was far from over, the Cuban Missile Crisis provided evidence that, in the nuclear age, compromise was necessary. Even now, nuclear weapons, with the awesome power they give to whomever wields them, represent the capability of modern technology for destruction. Today, the touch of a button could obliterate a metropolis and result in radioactive collateral damage. But this is coupled with the unprecedented level that technology can aid mankind. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a reminder of how close the world came to nuclear disaster, and the responsibility new world leaders have to prevent such disasters in the future.